Was Karen able to connect?
Yep.
Oh, good. Yes, please, let's do this.
All right, so the first subject for the afternoon session is a light touch on future recreational management planning that I know the board's been interested in understanding what some next steps would be. And I just want to also float out, I think there's actually a good connection to the end of our conversation in the morning session, because Casey and Mark are also going to transition a little bit in their presentation on the connection that rec management planning has to our planning framework as a whole. As some of you know, we promised in the master plan to come back to the board to speak more in general about our planning framework and our planning in the future. And so they also want to use this opportunity to just hit on that for a little bit. And it has a lot of context to what we were talking about, because we just mentioned that just for the prairie dog management, that was a four-year effort. And as you can imagine, we have these dozens of other plans and guidance out there. And if you just, the amount of effort it takes just to go through one thorough process to evaluate, to then go back, there's a lot of capacity and a lot of time in which you could have 20 years go by between plans just because of the lift it takes to work through an individual plan. So that's on staff's mind about how perhaps we could be, how there might be a more efficient and judicious way of doing our planning. And so Mark and Casey are also gonna just lightly hit on that as well, because it's relevant to this next big planning approach that we're taking. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark first. Yep.
Thanks, Dan. I think we're just pulling up the presentation. If you give us a moment.
Yep. There.
That next slide, isn't it, Casey?
Do you see it, Mark?
Yeah, if you just slide to the next one, that's perfect.
Of course.
Yeah. Good afternoon, board. I hope we've all had a bit of a break outside, and let's hope this isn't the sleepy part of the presentation. So all I just wanted to do was do a very brief introduction. Dan provided some very nice context there. And we appreciate the board today asking to talk about this subject. We as staff, we really do know how important it is. The high visitation, recreation activities, the facilities that support that, the impacts on resources, climate change associated with it, associated topics, undesignated trails. And so what we wanted to do today was just to begin the conversation and really just to respond to your request to talk about what does recreation planning look like. So as part of that, we thought a good way to do it, Casey and I, working with Dan and a few of the staff, set up a context for this by saying, yeah, what's a federal approach? And we touched on a little bit of that this morning through adaptive management. Then from that, what do you look at in terms of what our MP provides guidance on? How does that engagement work? And that's, staff, community, board, council. And then what are some of those possible topics? I just mentioned those a little bit earlier. I think a big thing for us, and I'm a big proponent of the master plan, obviously, having worked on that quite a bit. There you are, page 158. It's update the planning framework. Casey and I were just mentioning this. In truth, we were supposed to come back to the board in 20. We did have things like COVID, a little bit of evil in the work group. We tried to clean the decks, but we recognized that getting the planning framework set as part of the scoping to then set what the recreation management plan will really help us think about things like Karen mentioned it this morning, system, area, site scale, regional connections. So having that framework in place to then inform the rec planning seems to be critical. And that's again what Casey's going to touch on today. One thing we want to be clear about is we actually don't think that'll slow down the process. Casey will maybe be able to touch on a little bit of an outline of timeline, but we feel pretty confident that we can keep things on track for that 22, 23, 24, hopefully finish. The final thing I want to mention is I do want to introduce Casey now. As you probably a lot of staff know Casey very well because she's been with the department 14 years. And for a few of the newer board members, Casey's worked her way through, like, I think you began as a temp staff, is that right, Casey?
I did, planning temp.
Became senior planner for the department over the years, done some fantastic work on ag plans, the ag plan, TSAs, the master plan, jointly owned management plans, the recent ISPs. In fact, when we had difficulties with Wonderland Lake, working, trying to figure out how to better work with the community, it was Casey who we turned to, who was the safe pair of hands to bring that home. And so I'm pleased to announce that in the last few months, Casey's became the planning and design supervisor, and we all feel great in the department about that. And I hope as a board, you feel good as well. Like, it's more than a safe pair of hands. Casey's also innovative and very practical, and very pragmatic about getting plans done. So I think as we have this conversation today, and frankly have more conversations in the beginning of 22 and through Q2 of that year, I think you'll be impressed with Casey's approach as we develop this and how she's able to bring everyone on board. So with that, I just wanted to pass it over to you, Casey.
Thanks, Mark. Also, I'm just going to dive right in. And I know you guys have seen this image here before today, but this is a recreation planning process. It's the overview of the visitor use management framework that's used by federal agencies. And it informs OSMP's approach. It lays out a fairly standard planning process where we first build the foundation of the plan by getting clarity on why. And then we, define the desired management direction or desired future conditions. In other words, defining what we want and, ultimately, analyzing and identifying the management strategies to employ, the how we are going to get there. So these are the steps that would occur in our discrete, 22 to 24 effort, with the fourth step occurring outside of that time frame. And this is the visitor use management planning framework. I think you might have seen this too from the master plan. And at the outset, the very first thing is to confirm the approach with the OSBT. It's followed by reviewing guidance, data, and trends. And then in step 3, defining desired conditions and indicators. It's followed by exploring and evaluating and ultimately selecting, preferred alternative. And then, updating whatever plan or guidance there needs to be to reflect those decisions. So again, steps 1 through 5 would occur in 22 to 24. And then implementation, monitoring, and adaptive management would occur subsequent and after that discrete effort. So, confirming the approach of the OSBT, we certainly don't think of this as a one and done, one-time deal. We anticipate multiple check-ins, a study session, and we can discuss the potential for a process committee. Confirming the approach is not something that we would just do with the board, but we also anticipate having discussions, internally around some staff needs and also with the community. In the end products, those would include a project management plan. And so that would outline, the specific tasks and deliverables and put the project on a more detailed timeline. It would also include a community engagement plan, which would outline the engagement process. And we plan to use the city's engagement strategic framework to inform our engagement plan. And identify, where on the spectrum for this effort our efforts will lie for community engagement. And so, during this first phase, we're confirming the approach. We know that a big part of the conversation is going to be identify which topics this upcoming effort, will focus on, and we can take that according to the guidance and start from the guidance in the master plan, recreation strategies. But as Mark and Dan mentioned, before we delved too far down this path of discussing that, we really wanted to take a step back and take a look at the larger planning picture and context surrounding this effort. And as both of them also mentioned, the master plan calls for us to update our planning framework in Strategy FS10 to better inform and prioritize the efficient use of limited funding. And as I mentioned, while we missed that exact time frame due to COVID and related staffing capacity and such, we think the time is right, and that it's in the spirit of this guidance to ask and answer some of the bigger picture questions related to our planning framework as we embark on really our first big planning effort after the master plan. And really we have a lot more questions than just how to make our planning reflect financial realities. Some of the questions that we started with is like, what is it going to look like to update our master plan on a 5-10 year cycle? And, as we start looking at what that looks like, could, building out the master plan in more detail take the place of some of our plans, or maybe incorporate some of our system-wide plans? Again, this isn't, there's no answer right now, just these are some of the questions we're asking, and we'd like to just explore. This one, what about our system is more static and what is more dynamic? And as that specifically relates to, our planning framework, it's how do we plan so that it could be more responsive to dynamic situations, and maybe not revisit static ones as much? How do we sunset and update plans? Should we have more plans or less plans than we have now? So we do have over 20. A big question is, can the community understand all of our plans and processes? Is the community reading them all? And again, this is a little bit more specific, but what type of information or level of detail should go into each type of plan or planning effort? And so, just to elaborate a bit, on a couple of those questions, as I mentioned, we have over 20 plans, and it is really good work that I think that we can be proud of, and that in many ways has served the department and the community well. It's a solid foundation and definitely something to honor. It followed and even led best practices, at the times when these were developed. But the cumulative result of planning, and with this many plans, is also unsustainable, and that is created an unresponsive framework. So, for example, it's a standard best practice to update plans, and typically that should happen on a 5 to 10 year cycle. And currently we're on target to revisit recreation planning on an almost 20-year cycle. So I think it'll actually be 19 years in 2024 since the VMP was adopted. And we haven't updated any of the other plans. And this isn't because they don't need it, but it's because we can't get to it. And I think that it's unrealistic to think that in the future, this would change unless something about our framework would change. And this is something that a lot of land management agencies are currently grappling with. It's not just us. This was the standard best practice that we all employed. And now they're in response. It's not just us, but there are a lot of other agencies kind of responding by creating and looking at and updating their planning frameworks right now. So again, we just like to take a look at how to simplify, if it's possible, and explore to reorganize the information with potentially fewer plans or plan types. Can take a look at our planning hierarchy or organization. Most of our existing plans, they don't cleanly adhere to like a hierarchy regarding level of specificity. So they pretty much all contain a mix of broad policy, objectives, and strategies. And then they also include specific on-the-ground actions. So I think by identifying what types of information and level of information go into each plan could help us reduce some redundancy and be a good exercise in exploration. I mean, another aspect to kind of look at, or dynamic, is how our planning framework addresses or supports conditions or guidance that is relatively static, and conditions or guidance that could be more dynamic in order to address, frequently changing conditions. So in other words, how can our plans, our planning framework, or our processes, how can those help us better adaptively manage for things like the climate crisis, invasive weeds, increasing visitation, and then not revisit the static or more stable environments or departmental goals. And we really think answering these bigger questions, prior to diving into the specific, scoping questions around the specific topics for the 22 to 24 recreation planning effort will lead to a more productive and targeted process and conversation. And, I think we recognize and we know that, recreation management will need planning at all different levels, and that it likely can't just have a one conversation now that attempts to do everything at once, but hopefully create a framework for more future, regular conversations around topics as appropriate. So I know I asked a lot of questions and didn't have a lot of answers, but the next steps are kind of explore those themes as we look to update our planning framework. And then hopefully that will support our upcoming recreational planning effort. So thanks for the opportunity to present to you today, and I can turn it back to the board in the stop sharing.
Thank you, Casey, for that.
Of course.
So as we begin our post-lunch talk, is everyone still with me? Should I scroll through and see if anyone's sleeping?
Did I put people to sleep? Sorry.
No, not you, but the big lunch. So what we have written for our bullet points is scoping and next steps, and how does or will the plan fit with other OSMP plans, and does the name of the plan matter? So since we are at the beginning, the genesis of this plan, I think that it gives us the opportunity to really give our feedback and insight as to what we feel would be best for OSMP. So for example, we all know that one of our issues is increased visitation, and with the rec management plan, as we're calling it now, that could address that issue by development and creating more facilities, or it could address increased visitation by trail maintenance backlog and getting that up to speed. So, there's a lot of opportunity for discussion. And I just want to read this real quick, and then I know it's going to over to Hal. But this says, the question we must ask ourselves is, where is the balance point and how do we achieve it? In what parts of the system do we support activities that can be detrimental to local wildlife, yet feed the souls of local citizens? And where do we focus efforts on healthy habitats where wild ones can be more at ease day to day? These are salient and difficult questions to answer that can, at times, polarize groups who could find common ground if the answers were ventured that could gain some compromise. Molly Davis. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Hal. Were you wanting to pick that up, or was it Michelle?
Michelle, if you have a very clear view, I suggest you go. This is a big project. It's almost hard to know where to begin.
Yeah, and I think, and we were only given 30 minutes, and I think Hal, you and I were supposed to share in the facilitation of this, and we only have like 11 minutes left, supposedly. But
why don't you lead the facilitation?
Yeah, okay, so let's start with that first question then, which is like, I don't know. I mean, it's clear that like we have 20 plans out there, and this is, as you mentioned, Casey, that it will have been 19 years if we actually finish this by 2024. And so that's, saying that we're doing this, once every 20 years. So I guess I would like to just put out the series of questions that you had on slide 11, because that's how these all sort of fit together. And you had, in other parts of that slide, all the different plans. But like, I think we have a general idea of how, this is a really important plan, by the way. I look at the list of all the other plans, and they are also important, but this one is so critical right now. But I guess I would like to put it out to other folks, and what ideas do they have about how this fits in terms of our priorities, in terms of the other plans. And yeah, why don't you all start? Karen, you're on mute, Karen.
I'm intrigued by the series of questions that Casey posed as well. And especially the question of, do we need to, I'm ad-libbing, so I can't give the exact wording, but are we looking to expand on components of the master plan, or are we looking to create whole new plans that have a different label and are different? And there are two questions that I have with respect to that. One is, how do we make sure in doing any plan, whether it's a recreation plan or a grasslands plan or whatever, that we're looking at all the components and interests within the system, so that we're not just looking at RRSE topics or ag topics, but that we've considered the inner workings and interlapping impacts of all the parts of the systems and interactive uses. And I think that's really important for any plan. And my other question is what I'd like to hear staff's distinction between creating a plan for the whole system versus doing what we did in the TSA plans, which was taking a geographical section of the system at any one time. And I think that's an important cut in our thinking about what a plan entails. So if somebody on staff, if you've given that some thought, and I assume you have, could briefly address that way of segmenting things, I'd appreciate it.
Erin, I can answer it, but I think I'll give Casey a chance to go first if she'd like to.
Sure, and Karen, just to make, I'll give it a shot. I think I understood your plan or your question specifically was, you're right, we used to have system-wide plans. The last time we did a system-wide planning effort was before we had a master plan. And then we did our geographical planning at multiple levels and multiple scales with the TSAs. And then we recognized there was sometimes a long distance to go in between, a TSA plan and on the ground implementation. So we started doing ISPs, which were just planning processes, and so I think that is, I don't think I have the answer right now on, what levels of plans and how we're going to organize it, but I think it's a really interesting exercise to play around with and see if all those levels change, or now that we have the master plan, does that change things? And I loved your opening remarks about how it is looking, across and not just in the specific charter purpose or area, but how that all integrates. And I think that it's one of those things that's been percolating around in my mind for many months now, as I've been dawning on me that we're going to do this. But those questions, I think I don't quite have all the answers for yet, but I have faith that through a lot of discussions, we can sort through that.
Casey, could I just add?
Yeah. Please.
Again, sorry, it's handy to have the master plan sometimes around for this stuff, but on the if you go to page 183, you'll see that it gets to that discussion we had, which Casey was pointing towards, where we said if we do update business management, you're right, Karen, and it's what Casey was explaining. We need an integrated approach, and it just gives examples of where we cross over to ecosystem health. For instance, we've got a strategy on potential on-trail requirements. How would we preserve important agricultural landscapes where we do have recreation access? Community connections. How do we accommodate visitors of all backgrounds, abilities? And again, a coordinated approach to wayfinding, for example, in that CCI section. So the master plan provides some examples of what you're seeing, which is critical, and it's the unintended consequences you get in it, Karen. If we try to do one thing, we've got to make sure we think about the other scenarios. And then just the second part of your question was excellent. Like, how do we plan for a system, an area, and site scale? And that's where Casey's saying, yeah, we need to think about that. And Casey did point to earlier, we were recently at the COSAC conference, the Colorado Open Space Conference last week. Jeffco, Boulder County, Fort Collins, few other open space departments are all, as Casey pointed to, looking at how to update our planning approach. And just a simple example is Fort Collins now has like a system-wide approach, and then the planners are based zonally to do what Casey pointed towards, more of like an annual update in those zones to catch things as they come up with a bit more adaptive management while still having system policy in place. So we're not saying we're going to copy Fort Collins, but that's what Casey's looking into, isn't it, at the moment, of the different approaches other land managers are taking, as well as thinking about how we can be consistent.
Because their model was intriguing, but I'm not positive it's the, I don't want to just adapt it. I'd like to look at some of them, because some of them have been adapting this for a couple of years now. They've started this question back when we intended to, back in 2020. So I think there are some lessons to be learned in that way, being able to talk to them and see what their approaches were, what hasn't worked. And we're a different system. So, think of our uniqueness as well.
So when we talked about with our system, our 20 different plans, and I love the way that you framed it with, what's static and what's dynamic. I don't know if anyone has thought about applying that to the individual plans and then saying, out of these 20, these 10 are perhaps more static. These parts are really dynamic. And if that could be kind of dissected a little bit, maybe that would, sometimes you don't really know, and then you take it all apart and you're like, oh, that might work, to see how to kind of put it back together. I don't know if doing that to the actual plans itself is something that you think would be helpful.
You did read my mind. I think that's going to be a fun sticky note exercise and probably take up the
I'll come
entire
over
room.
with you. We'll just lay them out on the floor. Go for it.
But looking through that guidance in each plan and saying, what is static, what is dynamic, and what does that mean for the plan? Does some of it move to a different plan and some of it, go into a different type of process, or how, what does that mean for the various plans? So I think that there is a little dissection exercise that might teach us something about how we want to put it all back together again, as you said.
Other comments? Go for it, Dave.
So I just wanted to give a little perspective on the whole planning effort, because I think this is, where we were going to end up, and where we go from here is going to be very interesting. But initially, the department really didn't have any kind of formal planning. And so until about the mid 90s, they were just on the ground decisions that were made kind of ad hoc by various people. And so initially what happened was that we decided, well, we would do an area management planning effort. So we take, discrete parts of the system and do a plan, kind of do a comprehensive plan for that, for them. And as we did a couple of those, it dawned on some of us that, well, we were really missing the specifics that, the natural resources needed. And so there would be an effort to, take a look at the natural resources specifically and do plans related to them. And so that's where the forest ecosystem management plan actually came out. And then it dawned on a bunch of us that, we're really missing the system-wide element of the planning. And so that ended up with the visitor master plan. And out of that, then we kind of came back to that, chunking up the system, that we needed to really start looking at, specific areas for, visitor use, so that the trail study area planning effort kind of resulted from that. So my concern, and I think Karen and Caroline have certainly emphasized this, is that when we look at recreation or visitor use, we not look at that independently of what I think is the context of the system, and that the bedrock of the system is, the environmental values, the environment. And so the recreation is an element that's integrated into that, but we've got to make sure that in the focus on the human use, that we understand and realize that that is supported and it benefits that use, and the environmental component is really critical for that. So that integrated approach, I think, is really, really important, and that we need to, maintain that focus.
So Dave, are you saying that we should continue along with this plan, that this has a really important place in our whole system of plans, is to to do an update on this versus keep doing the TSAs and the ISPs beneath it.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
like we went one direction, now we went this direction, now we want to go back this direction. So I just want to make sure I understood where you came out in all of this.
Yeah, I think the visitor master plan definitely needs updating. It's about 20 years old, and so yeah, it does. But I don't think we can ignore or forget that, you know, the environmental, the natural resource aspects of these plans are really important. And so realistically, coming out of even this plan, there may be a need for more discrete, you know, focused planning efforts as well. And I don't know whether it's their TSAs specifically, but there would be some more frequent and focused planning efforts. But I do think this system-wide plan, either conceived as an update of the visitor master plan or you know, something else is definitely necessary.
Okay.
I think what Casey is really challenging staff right now and challenging herself is, okay, with the master plan, something we haven't had before, which is an umbrella for all 5 focus areas, which I think comprehensively make up the open space charter purposes. What is the role of that plan to support these individual planning efforts, and do the policy statements of these individual plans rest within the master plan? So that automatically triggers sort of a continual update look at our policies comprehensively across the various open space charter purposes. And so just to get us thinking, okay, we've never had a master plan before. What is its role in supporting all the other individual plans? And I think that's a really intriguing challenge for us to think about. And I know Casey's been sort of sitting on that for a little bit, but I think it's really important we answer that question of the proper role of the master plan in its relationship to the individual plans, and maybe try to get that foundational question answered before we launch headfirst into our next big planning effort. So, yeah.
Karen.
Anyone have any
I
final?
would, my reaction to your statement, Dan, is that I would not advocate opening up the entire master plan
No.
to reanalysis or revision. And I would state it in terms of to see if there are some things within the master plan that need to be questioned at this point. But otherwise, following the master plan in developing a, what are we calling this?
Recreation plan.
Recreation management plan, nested within the master plan.
Right.
Aaron, I appreciate you saying that, because I think you remember when we did the master plan, it was the first one we done, and the example we used was the transportation management plan, which started a bit umbrella, and now as they do the updates, as Casey was pointing towards, strategically picks on major topics to
Right.
tackle in the updates. And it's a really great point you've made. No, we couldn't take it all on, but what is it strategically and what's the priorities that we need to tackle? And I think that's what, again, Casey was pointing to earlier, where it's going to be a great conversation coming up in 22, hopefully the beginning of 22.
Well, I want to give you a chance to chime in. You're on mute.
It's a very broad topic. I take a somewhat, I guess I would say, sort of technocratic view on it, in that I think much like sub-community planning, the TSA approach has worked well for us over time. And we are investing in different system goals in various TSAs differently. And I think that works for me in general. And I think there was good planning that was done with that. So for me, the whole visitor and recreation planning piece is interesting because, first off, fundamentally, we can't really control people's visitation in the sense of they get in a car, they drive somewhere to our system. our point of interaction is what happens when they arrive, i.e., can they find a parking place? How much does it cost if it costs something to park there? What toys can I take off of my car and move past this particular gate with? Be it my kite, my skis, my dog, my, and so I guess I see this plan as touching on the goals and policy for all of those types of things which occur in each and every TSA, and particularly perhaps reopening the larger conversation with council around fees, permits, cost recovery, to make sure we get out of this endless political loop and that we have a clear view of our ability to make adjustments as needed, because we saw in COVID that the circumstance on the ground can change really radically from one year to the next. And it's simply too important to be able to work on some of this stuff than run through the whole political process. So I guess those are some of my thoughts. I really honor staff in this one. This is such a broad potential project that getting a clear view of what it is meant to do and not meant to do will be a really interesting challenge.
Thanks, Hal. Yeah, so I'll chime in as well. I think when, and actually I'm going to start with the potential name of recreation management plan versus the visitor use master plan. I think that, like, are you a photographer? If you're a photographer, are you recreating, or are you a visitor using the system? And so I think the name can be confusing when we start to begin to change the name or think about changing the name. It can also be confusing to the community because it may say, hey, this is a brand new plan, and how does this now interact with the VMP? So there's those sort of things. And I think addressing the static versus dynamic issues, we definitely need to, I think, revisit the plan. I guess I would be in favor in terms of scope, how we scope this of, is it an update to the visitor master plan? There are things that need to be updated. And can we boil the ocean a little bit and focus on those things that absolutely need to be revisited and updated, versus launching a whole brand new plan that looks like a whole brand new plan. I don't know, that's kind of what I'm thinking. I know that I actually don't have a written copy of the visitor master plan, but that is sort of the bedrock of how we think we can use the open space system. So yeah, I think that it is worthy of updating, but I think if we could narrow down what we really want to focus on versus, again, also how it interacts with the master plan, but what do we want it to do? Go ahead, Hal.
Sorry, you just gave me a couple ideas. I see this plan being, for myself, a little more granular. A couple questions that are like top of my mind. To go to the most granular, I could see myself after leaving this board coming back to the podium one day and saying, during this planning process, I'd like this board to define more what they mean about free heel skiing versus heel attached skiing. The industry has changed a lot since you made this last rule, and I need more clarity. Or I have heard that certain people have safety concerns about the lack of a landing envelope for paragliding below the flat irons, and this should be addressed in that plan. I'm also interested in sort of some things like, these are the adaptive management goals as far as trail capacity on these trails. So I see it getting I see this being a place where we take a little bit of a more technical dive into, Boulderites have these questions.
Free heel skiing, Telly. Roller skate down the third flat iron. Does anybody else want to, I don't know, Casey, if this really helps you with where we head next. I think about the 20 plans, and I think about this 2-year process and the fact that this is 16 years old already. And And just thinking like, could we focus staff's energy on implementing the plans that we've started? I mean, I think that there are some things like in the West TSA that we haven't implemented yet, certainly the North TSA. And I know that your staff's time is not, limitless. And so I think it's hard on the community when we say we're going into another a 2-year planning process when we haven't addressed and implemented the things that we said we were going to 2 plans ago. And I see you nodding your head, Karen. So
Yeah,
out there.
I would just add, if you look at, and Dave, you can attest to this, what are coming out of 2005 about the series of area plans that we were going to knock off systematically over a period of 5 or 10 years or so. I think what we realized is that each of these area plans in today's dollars could be a 20 or $30 million ask, and with a whole bunch of staff capacity. And that's why we came to you last year and basically said, we think we could support, because we have the master plan guidance, which basically says maintenance, taking care of what you have. There's a lot of fundamental stuff that we need to keep our eyes out on. And so with that, a lot of that capacity going right there, what capacity do we have to take on planning? And we basically were honest with you and the community and said, we think over the next 2 years, we can take on 10 years, we can take on two major planning efforts. This being one, and East Area Plan, I know it's been called for. I know maybe in the past, certain staff have said when we think we could get to that, but realistically, we have so many outstanding things we said we would do with North TSA, West TSA, that promising we could launch into an East TSA, but that would be disingenuous because we have a plan that would be done and implementation maybe not even be 10 years away. So I think we got to align our expectations and be honest and truthful with the community with what we're able to actually implement once we've actually done a plan. And my goal is to close that gap between when we do a plan versus when we implement, because I've seen it, and the flood didn't help, but I've seen it where, sure, we can do a plan, but if implementation is 10 years away or it's going to take 20 years to implement, we either say that in the outset so it's clear, or we basically don't embark on it till we have the right capacities to come together.
And do you feel for the implementation of this plan, are you visualizing like a 5-year, 10-year?
Well, I mean, I think that's part of next year. I think it's these questions of how narrow, how broad, granular, not granular. I mean, I think the scoping project in 2022, which we're going to be working hand in hand with the board on, laying out what the project management plan is for this plan, which will answer a lot of those questions. And I think that will give us a really good flavor. And I think we would all want to create a plan that's doable.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to go a long ways in telling us what the scale of this is.
I think with COVID, I hope that all of us don't forget how much more flexible we are. And going off what you're speaking of, if we have things that we know are not working, or we're making promises that we know that the follow through is going to be long or tedious or non-existent, let's shift. Because as we move forward, I think that shift and change and adaptation is going to become more and more valuable. So while the hard copy of what a plan is important, again, what we've all learned is a little bit of flexibility, is important. And so happy Mark pointed out page 183, because of course I turned the page, and on page 185, it discusses incorporating climate change into all levels of planning. And, just to say something that of course we all know, there will be a drop in our tax in 2035. So as we take on new projects, from this point forward, if it's like 2 years to get it off the ground, then we're at that 10-year mark, that whatever we're doing and wherever we're at, couple that with what the world will look like in 2030 and couple that with the, I hate even saying it, the unfortunateness of, perhaps a major event. So all of those things moving forward, I think in keeping with, what we all know is the truth, that flexibility is going to be really important.
Super. Dave, did you want to, you had your hand up, and Karen again too, then Karen.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say, Michelle, I do support and agree with your notion that updating the visitor master plan is probably the realistic path forward in this particular area. And I think, yeah, trying to kind of launch a completely new planning effort is a task that's probably beyond our capability. But I do think that it's certainly the community knows and understands the visitor master plan, and updating it, I think they certainly would recognize the importance of that. Having said all that, I just wanted to point out, for me, embedded in the word recreate is actually the notion of recreation. And so I've always seen, recreation as the opportunity to kind of step back and think about what it is that we need to be doing in the future to maintain and preserve the environmental qualities that we have around us. So thanks.
Karen?
Yeah, I want to second or third your suggestion, Michelle, of considering this to be an update of the visitor master plan, and the distinction between visitors and recreation, I think, is really important. And also the theme that we've come back on a couple of times is the need to integrate an update of the visitor master plan with all the other components of the master plan, so that we're not talking about visitor use in isolation of the natural resources or the agricultural resources and so forth. Before I leave, however, I want to find out where this magic page 183 is, because my visitor master plan is open and page 183 is 2 graphs of.
Same here. That's what I get to.
Yeah, that's not what you're referring to, either Mark or Caroline.
I think we were looking at the master plan.
I'm looking at the master plan, which is what Michelle showed you. Yep.
Is it
It's
PDF
can I
page
take
versus
the blame
printed
for that?
page?
What page is it, Mark Davison?
I'm going to happily take the blame because I've got the actual final draft. I don't have the final.
Ah,
Let me just pull that up for you.
Thank you, Karen. I was like, am I not getting it?
No, you and me both.
And he'll have a good laugh at me because he knows I can sometimes quote it by heart. Nice that you can get it wrong. Give me a minute.
so Casey, any final reflections on your part?
Sure. I think, one of the final reflections, I think, updating the VMP was certainly in the suite of actions that, we want to take a look at when we step back and look at our planning effort. But I just think we want to look at that, in the context of the master plan. And I am really looking forward to just taking a bigger picture look. And then, as you all said, let's narrow and focus our efforts on what this next 2-year process should be, and surgically go in there and do it. And that, again, I think my last slide said, it's not just one touch. We know we need to have multiple touches at different times. And so I think that a lot of the points that you bring up are very consistent with the themes that, we want to explore, and the questions and direction, that we're going to go. So
Thanks.
Thank you, Casey.
Yeah.
I would love to
page
get a
230,
hard
Michelle.
copy of the VMP before we launch into that process. Sorry, Mark.
Oh, sorry, and it's page 230.
230. Okay.
Oh, that's much further back.
I know. I realized the plan expanded quite a bit from the final draft.
Thanks.
Thanks, Karen.
Are we all feeling good about moving on?
I think think so. Casey, our next touch is going to be like early next year, you think?
I think so. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Casey.
All righty, so moving into kind of the meat and potatoes of our day, we are going to be discussing core messaging and vision. And I thought it would be nice, as we know that we're kind of discussing the first 50 years of the OSBT program. I just feel like reading today. So that is how I'm going to kick us off. So more than 50 years ago, when the city of Boulder was growing at a rate that would double its population every 10 years, visionary citizens realized that unless action was taken, we could lose our idyllic setting at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. Our mountain backdrop, the free-flowing creeks, the enormous green swath of farms and ranches protecting our eastern flank, and our biologically special natural environment. Plan Boulder, a local environmental group, had already worked to pass a blue line on the mountain backdrop above which the city was forbidden to provide water, and had passed a bond issue to preserve the enchanted mesa from development. But a more dramatic plan was needed. A conference of experts and citizens were brought together to explore ideas. More importantly, it was scheduled for the arrival of a new city manager. It worked. Within weeks, he proposed a city sales tax to purchase land. When the 4/10 of a penny sales tax passed in 1967, Boulder became the first city in the nation to tax itself to buy open space. As of last count, 45,000 acres have been protected. Now, a word of caution. Over the years, unless citizens remain vigilant, they can still lose what they think they have won in ways big and small. A new city manager moves the whole program into the Parks Department with a very different mission of active recreation. So an appeal to the city council in 1973 produces an ordinance drafted by citizens which formalizes the program. It creates an open space board of trustees, an earmarked fund, and goals to consider, such as quality of life, carrying capacity of the land, controlling growth, retaining aesthetic and recreational values of open land, protecting critical areas, preventing encroachment upon floodplains, and preserving agriculture. Then in 1986, voters took the ultimate step. Article 12, open space, was added to the city charter. A city charter is the constitution of a home rule city and can be amended, revised, or rescinded only by a vote of the people. More on this later, but for now, turn the page. That is by Ruth Wright. So moving into, that was kind of the message of the last 50 years. And what do we want our overarching message for the OSBT program to be over the next 50 years? I don't know if anyone wants to kick us off. I had time to ponder this at home.
I wonder, do we have a feeling that things have changed? I mean, I think this, when the open space program was created, like it's beautiful. And like, I don't want to mess with it. I think that it's worked well. We continue to have to tweak different things with, I mean, certainly climate change is going to change everybody's worlds. But I guess, is there a feeling that the vision has changed?
I would throw that out to someone that's been around long enough to see the difference.
Totally.
And that's
Yeah, I'm interested in everybody's viewpoint.
Well, I'll jump in. I think, Michelle, that was a good vision for the first 50 years, but my concern now is that what do we want to have the program be seen in the next 50 years? Because the first 50 years was we want a green belt, to protect the city. And so now we've theoretically got that. And so kind of given the current situation, what do we think it ought to be? And I think that, the community in 1967 was a real miracle, because what the community did was to vote to preserve scenic, beauty and the natural, the scenic values and the natural beauty. But what they didn't realize and what they really got is that the Boulder ended up preserving a tremendous amount of ecological diversity and beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And so I think what is incumbent on us is to make sure that we, hand that off to future generations. And the concern I have is that, yeah, okay, we have taxed ourselves, and that was important, because it was innovative and creative in that first 50 years. But now there are other things that, that I think are coming to the fore. And, open space and mountain parks are woven into the fabric of Boulder, the city or community of Boulder. But what does that mean exactly? And if you ask 100 citizens of Boulder what the open space mountain parks program means to them, you would probably get 100 different answers. And from my perspective, we need some coalescing, overarching vision that everyone, understands, no matter, where they're coming from. So that's my recommendation.
And I think kind of going off a lot of what I just read is there were, after the formation of open space, there were a lot of, really big moves that had a lot of really cool ideas, the Blue Line, Enchanted Mesa, and the work it took to do those kind of things. And so if you're asking Michelle, like, what is different, I would say that those types of, big moves that were just really strong net benefits for open space over these next 50 years aren't going to look like what they did before. They're going to be completely different, types of moves. So what are those? What could we bring to the program that really draws in these like huge net benefits that was able to be done over the last 50 years?
I don't know if it's Hal or Karen who was first.
I want to say that when I go out on the system and am in my planning mode and just interrupt people on the trail and say, would you talk to me for a few minutes? Where are you from? What do you like about this? And I pose to them the question of, what is it about this system that you want to have be here in 20 or 30 or 50 years? The responses that I've uniformly gotten are exactly what Michelle said to begin with. I want this to be the same as it is now. And in what concerns me is I don't see that as possible. And the reason why is because of the pressures on the system from the huge increases in visitation and in population and in residency in the region, and the number of people that are coming here to use the system from both within the city, within the county, and farther afield. And so my concern about the future is not that I want it to be the same, but that I'm concerned it's not going to be possible for us to sustain the system as it exists today with all the pressures that I know will be coming decade after decade. And I think it behooves us to really get serious about the question of how is the management of open space going to look different to be able to sustain the system, to sustain the wildlife populations that we learned about at the last board meeting, to sustain the visitor use that we have been talking about just recently, and to make sure that quote, all that can continue to happen, which I don't think it can, into the future. And the reason why I don't think it can continue to happen is I don't think we can continually double the number of visitors and sustain the native habitat that the native species depend on. Those two just come up against each other.
Well,
This is really exciting for me. Very rarely do we get to talk really big picture. I have a couple observations. I, over recent years, have really devoted a lot of my life to public lands related work, and the order of events to me is fascinating. Boulder began this project prior to the Wilderness Act and prior to the Scenic Rivers Act. And in that regard, you could almost perhaps, I mean, of course, being a Boulderite, you'd like to impute that we were early movers that caused Congress to come around and see that these values were important, et cetera. The fact is that over time, as more rigorous protections for public lands on a federal level have occurred, it's also become more of a reality that Boulder's open space system is urban adjacent. And urban adjacent land management is decidedly different from these other areas. And I mean, I've always commented, we have more fence per acre of preserved land probably than any other, land preservation system anywhere. Regarding the whole piece about change, like many Boulderites, I ended up here not only because of a love for this land and the landscape, but actually because I was interested in meditation. And so impermanence and the inevitability of change is not something that I'm worried about. I am worried about how are we doing our best to guide the change that I guess is ongoing. And Caroline, you made a couple really interesting points. There were certain events early on that were widely celebrated in this system, but there are also a lot of really unspoken successes that I see along the way. The prairie dog issue was a huge lift, and we dealt with a lot of difficult information, and it was very technical. But at the end of the day, what we really did as a board was make a decision that farming and agriculture had a place within this charter in our urban adjacent public lands area. And we decided that that place was important enough that we were going to help those goals. I think that's really interesting and unique. Food security and the idea that public lands, preserved lands that are urban adjacent can be used for that, to me, is quite fascinating. The frontier, I guess, for me, has a lot to do with what we're learning now about mental health and public lands. I think what we're doing on equity inclusion is really interesting within that context. America has seen a major mental health event, and categorically through their actions have shown us that they seek the solace of nature as a critical part of their mental health strategy for themselves and their families and their loved ones. And so I do think the work of visitation and recreation is hugely important. And while these things may not be celebrated the same way as some of these early accomplishments, if we can sort of navigate them well and decide what a great urban adjacent public lands program looks like, how we fit in relative to national forest, wilderness, parks for that matter, city parks, and where we are in that spectrum, I think that that's a remarkable thing to be a part of. And if we're able to accomplish something once in a while, that's wonderful too. I guess that's my 30,000 foot view.
Those were great comments. Thank you. I think
In terms of Michelle's initial comment of, a few decades ago, what has changed? And I just say programmatically, the huge shift in the last 10 years from an acquisition focused department for the last 50 years to where we're at today. Some of you may recall looking at budgets. If you looked at our CIP, even in 2017, which nearly $6 million every year was going to the acquisition program. where today, the last couple of years, it's been under $1 million, and those dollars have been shifted over to stewardship, is a fundamental shift in, I think, responding to some realities we're facing with this next phase of the open space lands. And so I think that putting major investment into this stewardship area has been a fundamental shift. I look at just some things in the last 4 or 5 years that have been put in place. Our agroecology program, which didn't exist before. That's a very innovative program in which we're trying to look at our agricultural lands as multifunctional, and to put a spotlight on the agroecology, like the linking of that, and a whole department set up for that. Our soil health department, brand new, innovative, doing baseline soil health stuff. The wildlife program we heard, which just got launched in the early 2000s, and where it is today, and all of the innovative monitoring work and restoration work. Our HD program, or Humans Dimensions, like John said, this is like cutting edge stuff, and we're so fortunate as a department. Most departments don't have hardly any staff, and we have a robust staff of tracking visitation numbers, visitation surveys. What are people experiencing? How do they experience our lands? What is their sentiments about being on the open space program? The fact that our rangering program has needed to be really increased. We're 24 rangers today versus what it was 20 years ago. We've now adopted trail condition standards. That didn't exist before. We're in the process right now, and you'll get updated, of trailhead condition reports. So we now have expected conditions of what our trailheads should be at. Large scale restoration. As you know, I put an invite to join you out at our Lower Boulder Creek efforts to do some really large scale restoration efforts. The creation of a science department with Brian Aneker, and last February's update to you on what the science team is up to, and trying to get our data under one roof, and actually creating out time to actually assess and analyze our data. And of course, the master plan. I mean, all these things are the last kind of few years. So I think there is continually a lot of innovation, a lot of evolving that we're doing as a department together with board, with our community. And so I don't think we are stagnant. I think, and no one has suggested we are. So I'm just sort of putting off the top of my head. We are an evolving department. We are sort of trying to assess where we're at with the times and adjusting our programming to that. So I'm certainly excited about the innovation we're able to bring to the table. And certainly what we need in the next 50 years is a great question. And I know as a department, from a staff perspective, that's what excites, keep evolving with what the needs are.
Thanks for that, Dan. I didn't hear a lot. I mean, there's definitely been a lot of innovations and changes. I guess I was asking more about like how we thought our vision for the department was different. Because I think what I kind of heard out of that was how we maintain and execute on that continued vision is really what we feel like we have impact on, or want to have an impact on. And if I were to add my own 2 cents to it, I guess, you know, I think, I mean, obviously the open space program was super visionary. It's, you know, one of the reasons why I moved here, why I love living here, and why I want to serve on this board. If I were to make any sort of tweaks to it at all in terms of the vision, is kind of along the lines that Hal was referring to, is that this, you know, open space program does provide a lot for our mental health. And if I were to just add on to that is, and I know it's we talk a lot about in our master plan about inclusion and maintaining this for future generations. I would just add the context or the lens of JEDI work, you know, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and making sure that, you know, all folks truly have access to this amazing asset, and for purposes of mental health, but also in terms of equity and inclusion. And this is a resource that's available for our entire community, not just City of Boulder, obviously, but including our visitors. But that's the only thing I would want to add to all of this, a more emphasis on JEDI. Sorry, Caroline, you were actually facilitating this. Now I'm going, go for it, Caroline.
Listen, we're doing our thing today. I don't know if I have a point. I just feel like saying this. It really struck me during our wildlife presentation. Was it last week or 2 weeks ago? I don't even know what day it is. Last week. When they were discussing how critical our volunteers are. And we know we have a really robust volunteer program, and we know we have really great people in Boulder that care. But for some reason, they were talking about the Raptor program and said, being able to watch these nests, and they were talking about how they had to extend closure on one area. They would have never really have known that without the volunteers. And one of the presenters, it was clear to me that this man was probably someone that she knew was like, he's been bringing out his telescope and doing this for 30 years, and he's just a volunteer, but I mean, probably one of the top experts in what he does in the country, and just does it because he loves it. And it made me think of that when Hal was talking about urban adjacent and what that would mean for a system. But I think that we are unique in that we're urban adjacent, but we're also Boulder, right? So we all really care about what we have. And I think our volunteer program is so robust. And I think during a presentation, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have like the largest in the country. Can I say that? But on top of that, as we're all discussing this, focusing on the youth, which I know we do a really great job of. And that's really, when we talk about what happens in the next 50 years, it's our kids. So I just kind of felt like wrapping in, like the younger and how these volunteers have really helped to shape this program, and how and what that means for Boulder. Because again, in one of the presentations, Dan, you talked about the numbers that the volunteers bring, like with them, and the hours and the work that they do. It's, I mean, like literally millions of dollars of equivalent to what they provide open space. Is that accurate to say, Dan?
Yeah, and thousands of hours. Yeah, I think we bring that up when we do the E&O update, as well as even, I think Lauren incorporates that into some of the budget talk as well.
Do we ever hit a point where, I know we did for COVID, but where we can't, for lack of a better word, facilitate more volunteers? Like, do we ever have a surplus where people are like, I want to help, and we're just like, this is as many people that will fit onto this trail maintenance portion, and that's all we can do for the day? Does that ever happen, or is it a little bit more organized than what I'm describing?
No, Caroline, I can answer that question. Yeah, no, unfortunately, we do turn away volunteers. It's kind of a capacity issue. Not asking for any extra staff here, because all work groups would ask for extra staff, for what we need. But actually, at the moment, what we do is, the way we've done it is do the citywide cooperative. So what we've done is set it up across departments, and Janelle Freeston's been one of the key people on this in our department. Mm-hmm. That citywide cooperative tries to share it around departments, Parks and Rec, the library, Housing and Human Services. But yeah, you're right. We're asking interesting questions. Like at the moment, frankly, we can get a lot of volunteers through the business community, which is brilliant for trail operations, stewardship projects. At the same time, though, we might be neglecting some of our different community members, like youth, because frankly, it's easier to get business corporations to come in. So we're having these discussions about maybe we do reduce the number of volunteers based upon our current capacity to focus on youth and get youth involved in climate action projects, etc., restoration projects, to help even build their awareness going forward. So we're starting to ask some of those key questions you're bringing up. They're excellent questions.
Yeah, because the numbers, that you guys get for what the volunteers do, I mean, it's astounding, because, the work is completed and it's equivalent to a lot of money. And, when you compare that to any of our other sources of revenue, it seems like that is, and then you get this caring community that, loves the land and are also voters and taxpayers. So it's just something for us to think about as we continue forward with our conversation.
It is, and actually one of the newest models is the train the trainer model, where we're trying to look to create volunteers who are like experts within that certain area, and then they can train other volunteers, so you can grow programs that way. So we're doing our best to look at like innovative ways to grow the volunteer program.
I feel like you'd have a wait list for a year to hang out with the 30 years experience rapper guy, right? I mean, I'd sign up.
Well, and one anecdotal story is, I don't know if you know this, but Burton Stoner, the ranger supervisor, he's a biology degree and he's a bat expert. So he will turn up in the bat costume for the volunteers every it's part of the annual event. So that's worth attending. I'll give you an invite for that one day.
Please do.
All right.
Can I just jump in quickly because it's related to children? I think one thing you guys all know about me, it's partially a joke and partially serious. The only thing I have all my political capital in on this board is getting the sledding map for children issued sometime in the next 20 years, and perhaps an expansion of our approved sledding areas. But all joking aside, my big concerns for the system are human beings able to access their own bliss when they're on the system? Is our wildlife able to access their own bliss on our system? And have we found a good balance between the two? And then above and beyond that, are those experiences creating new environmentalists that are enthusiastically bringing their volunteerism and their interest to other communities? Which leads me, I mean, it's almost like at the point with this department where I see outreach as the like ultimate final goal. Almost like we have so many highly educated staff members, also general community members in Boulder, and our ability to communicate our experience to other global communities who may have interest in exploring, amping up their own preservation activities is really fascinating to me. And it's like, I almost wonder if the staff could create a, what do they call it, a stage, or when a university does a visiting gig to another university, if there's a possibility to bring people from foreign countries who are working on nascent preservation systems and projects to come and participate with us, and that we can be helpful in that. I don't know, that's something that crosses my mind regularly too.
I think about that all the time with Instar, you know, because I'm a fan of cold weather places in the Arctic, and there's a lot of amazing scientists and universities that I feel like would be such a great swap, like exactly what you're talking about.
Karen, yeah.
During this discussion, I'm thinking of conversations that I've repeatedly had during this election campaigning season, which have to do with the limits to growth that the city has approved and abided by, and the perception that CU has no limits to their growth. They're unwilling to say, you know, we are going to limit ourselves to this many thousands of students, and keeps acquiring more land in the city and expanding their land-based boundaries of how big the campus is in all directions from the main campus. And I'm not just talking about CU South, I'm talking about the acreage that CU owns and holds within the city of Boulder. And the conflict that is increasingly growing in the city of Boulder about how the city is butting up against the growth of CU as an institution, and how those two entities are sort of battling out who's going to be bigger and how big they're going to be. And when I think about that conflict, which is currently on the minds of many, I'm thinking about the open space and mountain park system, and the fact that as several of you have indicated, there are limits. And people have mentioned the growing number of staff members, growing the number of volunteers. We've repeatedly mentioned the increasing number of visitors. And what is not increasing, as Dan pointed out, is the acquisition and the number of acres. We're almost at a plateau with the number of acres that are going to be in the open space and mountain park system. And I bring that up because as we think about the future of the open space and mountain park system, I think we need to be forward looking and say, okay, we know that the number of acres is plateauing and that we're going to have a limit on the size of the city open space and mountain park system. And I think we need to then address the question of what does that mean in terms of numbers of staff, number of visitors, number of volunteers, as well as Hal put it, the bliss of the inhabitants of the system in terms of the wildlife and the natural species, the native species, and the number of visitors and users. But I think we would all agree that the acreage of the system is limited in the future. Is that a correct assumption on my part?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the master plan guidance with it being a tier 3 strategy, I still think key acquisitions is something that we would look at, but it didn't rank as a tier 1 or tier 2 strategy. So I think as far from a policy standpoint, I think you're right. I know that we've analyzed internally where we thought some key acquisitions could come up with, and basically I think we were within 5,000 acres of what would be considered more of a priority type of acquisition. So, but of course, an update to the master plan could also instruct us to do otherwise. But as far as the guidance we have right now, it is, I think you're fairly accurate in that what we're seeing as a plateau, and I wouldn't expect that to be spiked up in the near future.
Well, and in terms of the land availability.
Which certainly, yeah, we're looking at in holdings a lot of the times when we look at future acquisitions as opposed to expanding outward.
So I would advocate that on our list for looking to the future, that we address the question, given the plateauing, the relative limits of total acreage. What does that mean in terms of number of visitors, number of volunteers, number of staff, and also the economic future? Because I've been approached by city council members and candidates in this election cycle in terms of the question of, so how much is our open space system going to cost? Are we going to keep increasing the budget? And where is it going to go if we're not acquiring? And are there limits on the total finances, the budget that OSMP is going to require from the city? So I would advocate that we look to limits for the future and set some goals and perspectives about where we're headed.
Can I chime in here? I have to drop in 6 minutes, so I just want to get a few ideas out. Karen, I think along those lines, I want to also introduce the concept of distributing usage across our system. And if we are going to look at users and the impacts on, the number of users on certain trails, we should also be looking at our maintenance backlog and making available trails that have been closed to users and really trying to distribute that usage across the entire system. The other point I wanted to make before I go is, and this is 2 speakers ago, Mark, I love that we have so many volunteers, and you mentioned that we can, only take on so many volunteers, and you're talking about bringing in more youth programs. I've heard that during our field trip and also in one of the presentations. I do want to say that is also a JEDI issue, having paid people to work on our trails is, because people who don't have the luxury of independent income can't really work on our trails, and therefore they can't be connected to our system or to our lands. It's just really important to give them an opportunity to, and it is a JEDI issue to make sure it is a paid thing. I'm not saying paying a lot, but a paid opportunity, because otherwise they're not going to have that, the free time if they have to pay for their electrical bill, and the repair, new tires for the car, boots to work, to do the job, as we talked about it in the youth program. So it's great that we have volunteers, but I fully support the idea of investing more into the youth programs. And because I know you all have been very focused on diversifying the participants there outside of even the city of Boulder. And it is, a huge investment into our future. These are our stewards, and they are going to take care of our lands going forward. So I just wanted to impart those two things, and now I'm going to teacher conference.
Michelle, before you leave, could I clarify what you're saying about distributing usage? Because I'm not sure whether you mean opening trails in areas that do not currently have trails, which to me means fragmenting habitat, or whether you mean distributing people onto existing trails.
I mean, I guess both. I would like to look at an entire inventory. I'm not saying, hey, take our most treasured and fragile habitat and put people on it. I absolutely am not saying that. I'm saying, let's look at the whole system and let's do things that make sense. If there is a a trail that has been closed, or an opportunity to allow people to get into different parts of the system, and opening up those trails. But I think we all know that usage is concentrated in a few areas, and some folks would feel like there are just not enough in that 45,000 acres, enough trails for them.
And hey, Michelle, if I could just respond to the youth subject you brought up. Yeah, you're right. In the Junior Ranger program, we're trying to diversify and make it easier for folks to apply from underserved communities, specifically Latinx. And actually, I'm missing a meeting today. It's downstairs in the hub, and it's Nature Kids Boulder, and that's working with underserved youth and how we can engage in the community and provide more opportunities. And we're nowhere near the finishing line, but it is nice to, as you talk about, we're trying to make these efforts, and looking forward to bringing them back to the board over the coming months just to talk about them more, because there is some really interesting efforts starting to emerge that are really trying to think about just what you said. And it's going to be it's a tough subject to tackle because we've never really tackled it before, but I can see the genuine attempts now that are occurring at the staff level and in the community.
Thanks for doing that, Mark.
Thanks, Michelle.
Great. Where do we head from here, folks?
Staff did prepare a couple of minutes of materials. If you're interested, I believe we emailed them out yesterday, so we don't need to present them, but just wondering if perhaps there was any comment or reaction to trying to pull together some statements that are in the master plan that have a little relationship to visioning.
I think you're referring to the PowerPoint slides that are lifting segments from the master plan altogether. I would prefer not to spend our time looking at those again. I think we're all familiar with that information, and I appreciate your putting it all together so that we can review it before the meeting. But I for one, would rather not spend time looking at the PowerPoint. How do the rest of you feel?
That's fine. Just keep the discussion kind of flowing and hold off on the presentation.
Sounds good.
Well, one thing that I thought would be helpful is if we just saw if any board members saw any critical work in the next 50 years whether or not it was something this board was capable of doing, or whether it would need to be an act of the citizens, that you felt is critical for ensuring our ability to meet all these goals.
I mean, I immediately want to say water. You know, I think being out west and all of the changes that are happening, and while it's not exactly what you're asking for, I think that it's you know, so vital and so important. And I don't know, I don't know. I just I think being a recent transplant to the west side of America, the water situation, it seems very different than where I grew up. So wrapping my head around this type of drought and what it means, and how people are going to react in different states, and you know, even different counties and cities, like, you know, Denver seems a little greedy, you know, for example. So, you know, how does that all play out? You know, does someone just kind of repipe and take, and then there's like, does that happen? You know, I don't know.
I agree with
So,
you,
sorry.
Caroline. I think water is a important issue for the next 50 years, both for our ag uses and for the sustaining the existing habitat throughout the system. I'm also concerned, as I said before, about the limits of the land and how it's used. I'm concerned about thinking that we can have trails on all parts of the system and sustain the populations of wildlife that depend on that acreage. And I think we need to do some really careful planning into the future before deciding that we're going to build trails on areas that are currently unfragmented, because of all the scientific data that shows if we start putting trails in those areas, we're going to lose the populations of native species that we care about, both in terms of the charter and in terms of our vision statement and our master plan.
Yeah.
So I want to jump in. Hal, I'm intrigued by your notion of blissful wildlife. So I'm looking forward to pursuing that more in the future. But,
I saw a very blissful raptor circling over the.
Super blissed out.
I would like to, I'm a little concerned by our conversation, and here's the example, although I apologize for the context, but I do think it merits some consideration. And that is a core message, you know, is overarching. It's all encompassing. It includes water and land and, you know, wildlife and everything. But it's simple and it's direct and it's easily understood and it rolls off the tongue very easily. And the one I'm thinking about, and I do apologize for this as the example, but is the Make America Great Again. And all of a sudden, you know, MAGA has just, you know, everyone knows about what that means. And I am just very concerned that somehow we have a core message or overarching message for the open space and mountain parks program that rolls off the tongue like that. And I'm going to just put a couple of suggestions out.
Good.
And they're by no means you know, final or anything, but you know, open space and mountain parks, you know, Boulder's bedrock in changing times, or open space and mountain parks, a testament for land and community. Something like that, you know, is and I use this guardedly as well, but it's almost biblical, or Quran, or, you know, however you want to, you know, encapsulate it. But it's something that I think we need to have this community coalesce around, so that all these other things we attach to that, and everyone understands that why we are doing these things that, you know, we are doing because of this overarching message. So that's my concern.
Run by your second one again, please.
A testament for the land and community. And then, you know, those are just kind of thoughts off the top of my head, but I do think, you know, we ought to, it's instructive that, you know, that campaign message,
Slogan. Yeah.
slogan, everyone knows, and they knew it within a month. Everyone, no matter whether you supported it or not, you knew what it meant. And I am hoping that we can come up with that. I think we ought to be in the lead on this. If not, you know, members of the community certainly led the initial effort, and they may very well do it again, but I think it's incumbent upon us as trustees to urge that, you know, we pay attention to this need in the future.
I think you're right on, Dave. And my perception is that we need some of the many marketing folks in this town to form a committee and put together their kind of thinking. It's kind of a marketing slogan that we're going for. And there are professionals who know about this. And I think that's where it's going to roll off the tongue and come from. And I would advocate that the board recruit and put together a committee of marketing professionals to give us some suggestions. Because I'm no good at this, so it's not going to come from my tongue.
Well, obviously I'm not either, but I agree that that there's certainly potential there that we can address.
Yeah.
I feel like Boulderites would definitely embrace like the love and tranquility from Native American culture. And I think that's something that we're already, you know, really gearing towards and have been in the last couple of years. So that's another idea. But yeah, as far as something really catchy, people really pay the big bucks to have someone come in and do that for them, right? But when you said that, I you know, immediately was like thinking about Chief Left Hand or something similar to that.
I had a couple thoughts to add on that. I personally, and especially in the last year, I've always known this as an environmentalist, but now it's a lived experience, and that is our largest fear in the future, forever and always, will be greed. And greed, especially the larger a development project gets and the more economic value it has, the more stress will come to bear on this group and what we are trustees of. And figuring out how we're going to be clear about that our system will be a place where environmental analysis is ensconced above other concerns, most certainly economic concerns. And that over the long term, we will not accept life and safety as a consistent rallying cry for disposal, because the problems that lead to life and safety issues are errors of human judgment and prior planning, of which it is not the responsibility of this system to bail out consistently over and over again, and thus participate in a never-ending series of cuts, which ultimately end up in a fragmented body. I think that the concept in the charter about disciplining growth and how that was originally part of this vision, and communicating or reminding members of the community that many of the people who originally built this system that we take care of, the idea was there that growth and exponential growth in particular, fundamentally and always would be a risk to the bliss for everyone, the bliss for people, the bliss for the animals, and that needs a long range view. And pursuant to that, it's my view that at some point in the future, this board should encourage in looking at the current parts of the BRC related to transfer between departments in the city directly into the charter. I don't, it makes me uncomfortable that this piece of that lies in the, even though in my mind it's written in the charter alone, to have an additional piece in the BRC strikes me as a risk. And that perhaps ultimately too, we may want to figure out some of these other areas, like for example, areas where there are listed and threatened species. We don't want to be dragged repeatedly through multi-year processes that take our attention away from our core work, which are really designed about facilitating development and or other human-oriented projects, but ultimately sap a lot of our bandwidth and ability to do what we're primarily charged with. And at some point, perhaps seeking whether it would be an action of the board or a larger action to just make a clear statement that threatened species and disposition of those in exchange for development will be permanently unconsidered. Those are all things that are interesting to me.
I just want to add to your list, knee-jerk reaction, Hal, at the end of it. And in addition to threatened and endangered species, sustaining large habitat blocks unfragmented.
Yes. Sorry to lay it all on the table, but sometimes you got to do it.
So the challenge for us is to how to coalesce these ideas into a concept that I think is understandable and graspable by all parts of the community. And so hopefully as we move ahead in the future, that we can continue to have this conversation and get some focus on that and maybe some help as well. I think all these are good ideas. It's a matter of, okay, what kind of package is it going to be that we convey them in?
The procedures that we discussed earlier today, we're talking about committees of board members working on things. And I wonder, Hal and Dan, if you have any insights into committees of community members that are initiated by the board and staff.
Well, I mean, you could look at the community committees that were put together through trail study area plans as an example of when community members came together with the department and the board. So, I mean, I guess there's examples out there.
So the planning, the city's planning effort certainly had a community participation component to it as well.
Well, the community collaborative group that worked for years as part of the West TSA effort, I was on, and that was a group of, I don't know, 10 or 15 people. My sense was they were appointed by some combination of, I think, staff. No, actually, the way that came together was different interest groups were asked to nominate their candidates. So the conservation community put forth 5 names, the recreation community put forth 5 names. And thanks, Steve.
That whole effort came out of the visitor master plan process and was then an extension of that after approval of the plan.
Yeah.
But I'm talking, Karen, about the citywide review of city planning that was done in the past years. They called it a blue ribbon committee or whatever, but it came up with kind of a
and who appointed the blue ribbon committee? Did it come from the city manager, or did it come from the council, or?
Yeah, I think council ultimately approved it. The manager may have kind of led it, but it was a
Well,
council.
if we were to follow that pattern, if we recruited or put together some names of suggestions of people with experience in marketing, for instance, for a special committee, we could put all those names together and then Dan could appoint them. Is that a reasonable process?
Yeah, why don't we put that out here, and I'll take it back. I don't have any experience working at the city level with that suggestion, but happy to look into that.
I mean, I would see it as a cooperative effort between, the staff and the board. So that there'd be agreement on, okay, and then presumably the participants would have to agree as well, but.
Yeah, and then I would see that the committee working with the board, not totally in isolation, right?
On the topic of committee, and this goes back to the very, very beginning of our day, I really do feel I've tried to do a great job to be more of a conduit to the agenda than a creator of the agenda. This is the first time I want to suggest that we alter the agenda in the near term, and I'm looking for your approval. At our last meeting, we talked about the committee, which we previously had, that was doing the disposal policy. And it seems like we're now really agreed that we want to see a coherent application package on any disposal. And we really moved that process along. It would mean a lot to me if we could bring that home under the remainder of my term. And I do think personally, the documents staff brought us, which has gone through 2 layers of refinement, and which was very good to begin with and has gotten even better, is pretty close to the big time. How do people feel about that?
I haven't looked at it recently because I assumed there was a committee working on it and I'd get a chance to see it again. So I'm not ready to say it looks good and it's ready.
No, but are you ready to see it again soon? In a
Well,
board meeting?
If enough work has been done on it, yeah. I don't know what's happened to it is my bottom line.
It's looking like a A-, and we can bring it to strong A in short order.
Yeah, I think whatever status it is in, it's worthy of bringing back to the board for further consideration.
I'm sorry, did I get lost? Are we talking about what we're getting an update on this?
We've shifted topics totally.
We're talking about committees and where our board committees are. And I just brought your and my committee, Caroline, on the disposal document. We have our committee sort of left off. I'm suggesting that we reconvene it with the aim to bring that project in before the end of my term. And I'm asking you're all positioned to agenda that.
Yeah, I emailed you back in my head, but I don't think I actually typed it.
Well, I got the email.
I read it just the other day.
So I guess I'll send it to you now. My thought when you sent that was, do we want to wait and see what we are presented with next month? Because is that not one and the same?
What are we being presented with? I don't believe there's any planned presentation on this topic.
Dan, help me.
No, this committee's work is not agended right now. So there is no disposal process item.
It's the easement update.
I think, yeah, she's referring.
Oh, easement update is different.
Of the real estate group.
That's different.
Yeah, well, the real estate group does take charge of coordinating all the information, putting it together for easement requests. So they'll probably touch upon that as one of their duties. But no, specifically, they're not going to be coming forward with this committee's work.
I felt like it would be not the same work, but whatever was outlined would somehow be similar or pertinent to finishing the disposal process. But I'm wrong a lot, so.
Well, that might mean that it's a perfect time to, as Hal is suggesting, bring back the draft, because we'll have the staff presentation about the easements, and be ready to go back and look at the draft, right?
Yep. One really critical point of clarity. I think part of where we went wrong in process on this is that we refer to it as the disposal process document, but in fact, the disposal process is managed by this board and this board alone. It is really a disposal application explanation. It is a guidance of how one might ask the department for a disposal. By placing it in that context, it becomes much more manageable.
Yeah, and the process is outlined in the charter, so we're not messing with that, right?
Correct.
So I
This is
think
just what the binder you need to give the department looks like.
the two conversations, I think, fit pretty well together at next month's meeting. So yeah, I think if it's ready for further consideration, we should do that.
Yeah, I'm just looking at November's agenda is pretty full. Would you be comfortable with us, Hal and I, just working on in the next 2 or 3 meetings that we'll get it on there?
Well, how do you want to meet with me? Am I kicked out of the club? Am I in
No,
the club?
no, no. I'd like you to be back on the committee. We'll get with Bethany and Dan like we did before. We'll move it forward. And I'd be more comfortable, like Dan is saying, promising that we bring this home during the remainder of my time with you as soon as possible, but maybe not by the next meeting.
That's what I was gonna say. Do you want to try and have us have a meeting prior to the board meeting or after the board meeting?
I think we could take that up offline. The real point is just setting expectations about when it will be brought to the board. Karen.
As someone who has not looked at it recently, my suggestion would be for us to get a copy of whatever current means in terms of this draft as an information item in the November packet, and then deal with it at our December board meeting.
That seems more realistic.
No, I think that's a good suggestion.
Do we get a Christmas party this year?
Only if it's a party with you and your square and me and my square.
Yeah, I was gonna
We
say,
can have it at my house. Can we have a party?
this is your Christmas party, Caroline.
Oh.
So should we do a 5-minute break before we head into the final session?
Yeah, let's do it quick. Grab a cookie and
Yeah.
Okay.
With it being the last topic of the day, and I'm sure everyone is getting a little tired of sitting in front of their computer, it wouldn't be upsetting if we didn't even take the allotted 30 minutes. What I really want to discuss with climate change and open space really actually deals with something that is not my forte, and I don't understand really well, and I don't feel alone in that, so I don't feel bad saying that. But I do think that it is critically important for me to advocate and push for what I think is going to, in the long run, cause survival or sustainability. I don't even know how much I love using that word anymore, but I think that when it comes to climate change, right now, I feel pretty strongly that the only topics that really make sense to discuss is how to really implement this into our budget, how to talk about if we have any consensus on from a specific time frame moving forward, with trying to understand costs that are qualitative and difficult to pinpoint and figure out what these true costs are. And additionally, disclosure. And I don't know a lot of the city rules and what our department is able to do compared to other departments, but I think that it is really important for us to discuss these things because I think that they are going to be the most impactful, where I just feel like everything else is, while good and great, it's not going to really make a dent. So I'm asking to see if I can gather support from Dan and other board members and have everyone talk about suggestions of what we're able to do. And how far financially we can move things along and in what time frame. So Hal, I know that you are the money guy, so you might understand this better. And I saw Lauren on here as well. And I know when I first got on the board, her and I talked and I brought this up. So I'm not quite sure the best way to kind of start this off, but for our upcoming budget, are we able to really start figuring out a way to implement the cost of something that is there? I'm so sorry, my child just walked up. Give me 1 second. What baby?
I'll just colloquy a little bit. So as you know, staff wanted to come forward proactively in September to begin to launch into a more sustained conversation about climate crisis, climate action, how the department is thinking about it, how the whole city is thinking about it. So it definitely is something, Caroline, that we didn't view that September meeting as a one-off and now we're done and we're washing our hands. And in fact, we wanted to set that conversation up because we do anticipate us taking some department-wide action, continuing that effort and in some sort of innovative ways that John, I think, and Brian were happy to talk about what's in store for 2022, other than our programming that is climate related. So that was the purpose of September, to sort of set up a foundation, because we are anticipating this work. Whether it goes as far as sort of, I think maybe what you're envisioning, I think that's a question. But if you're interested, John or Brian would be more than happy to talk to you about that 2022 effort that we're going to start, that I think upon some of what you're asking. Or we could put it in a written memo and come and update you at a later meeting.
Yeah, I think it's again, and I'm asking for help because I know that I'm not an expert in this matter, and whether you want to call it net zero and working on the emissions, or if it is disclosure and just really starting to gather and write down, create a committee, get help from all the wonderful people in Boulder. I've spoken with Brian, and he and I shared some really great ideas, and he gave me a lot of background information, which I was really grateful for. I just feel that it's so important to start discussing this and putting these numbers down. And like I said, I don't know the best way to do it. I don't know what the right way to frame it up. Yeah, Karen, please, thank you, save me.
I don't know that I'm going to save you or anybody, but I think at the root of what you're requesting, Caroline, and thank you for taking the initiative on this, is what actions OSMP can do that are most substantive in terms of the contributions from the city of Boulder in terms of addressing climate change. And I don't know if you have available, John Potter, to throw up on the screen the graphic that you used in the staff presentation a month or two ago, whenever it was. But you had the elements of the master plan and which ones directly and indirectly contributed to addressing climate change. In my view, if you can pull that up while I'm talking, that would be great, I think. In my mind, the contributions from OSMP are, I think, less about reducing emissions and more about carbon sequestration. And I think they come under the category not only of our ag program, but also our native habitat program, because our grasslands, our native grasslands sequester more carbon than any ag operation can do on a per acre basis, as I understand the data. But I think it would be really helpful for OSMP to create a graphic of carbon soil sequestration contributions in terms of the city and emissions reductions to show the relative proportion of both of those aspects as they contribute to the city's approach to climate change. And one of the things in John's graphic, that the slide that I'm thinking of, which flashed by in only minutes. Oh, yay, it's coming up. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, thank you. And I think the indirect is the blue stars. Well, in my mind, EHR1 is not indirect. It's an absolutely direct source of carbon sequestration. So I would revise this graphic to show that EHR1 is a red star, because the large high quality habitat blocks are sequestering carbon in our native grasslands, right? So I don't know why you thought that was indirect as opposed to direct, but I'd be happy to hear a correction to my perception. Anyway, it's the graphic of, how many acres of native grasslands we have, and therefore the approximate contribution to carbon sequestration that comes from that versus the contribution to soil carbon sequestration that comes from the ag acreage, just as a proxy for we are contributing and giving us some quantified estimate. And I'm not talking about doing a 20-year study to come up with an exact amount.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad that you said that, because I think that, and I feel like I've expressed this every time that I brought it up, is the fear is whatever you create, or, like when the money's wrong, people can get upset, and it's hard, right? It's like, well, was that supposed to be in that category or that category? So really, in essence, what I'm asking for is to create something that will probably be wrong. But even going further, from what you're talking about, there are software programs and things where it becomes easier to compute them in to build and see, and along with, if this software can make all kinds of graphs and show us, from all of our different units within open space, like, what does all of this really look like? What are the true costs? And of course, that's obviously a very hard question. But how do we start to mitigate those impacts? How do we start to use our money in a way that we start to operate differently in response to that? And the hope is that we're such a cool, innovative city, like Dan was talking about like an hour ago, all of our departments, and we're so lucky to have so many things within our open space program that other people don't. And in the big picture, I would just, of course, love it for us and love it for Boulder, but the hope would be that it could jumpstart something with, our neighbors in open space, and then continuing from there, that it just becomes easier and easier to document this and really start talking about it. But I just feel like if it just doesn't get in the financials, it's just never going to go anywhere. Go ahead.
Can I talk about a little of the challenges related to that quickly? I agree with you on the end product. The real essence of the issue is that within generally accepted accounting principles, which they call GAAP, there's a series of rules, and all of this exists as what you call a non-GAAP measure, non-generally accepted measure. And I think the department is in a little bit of a bind, because until the city clarifies the nature of a non-GAAP style measure that they'd like to do with this and applies it across the city, we could duplicate efforts and come up with a system with a lot of time and effort that was, quickly scrapped. And so we really need the city to define some sort of a non-GAAP carbon measurement measure with all the related disclosures in order to be assured that we don't waste department time is my best understanding of the bind we're in on actually quantifying this stuff.
But I feel like no matter who does it, that is like the problem, right? Like you're going to put it all together and it's probably going to be wrong. And that, you know, is just the nature of the beast. And I agree with you. And that's, you know, the other portion that I don't understand is what are we allowed and able to do within the city, and as opposed to doing it to implement something. What if we do it for it to just be its own freestanding thing that we know, you know, again, will probably be wrong or need quite a few revisions before it could really flow into something, but nevertheless, we're starting to do it.
Let me come back with a similar idea. In our letter to council related to the climate item that we're going to put on there at your request, why don't we encourage council to expedite the creation of a citywide carbon accounting system and say that we as a department would be a beneficiary of that and would appreciate that?
I feel like that's what we were saying earlier about kind of passing it off. And I mean, it's not a bad idea, but is that going to be on their 20 agenda items that they're going to pick up and be like, you know, Caroline from Open Space really wants to do this. I think we're going to, you know.
I'd like to give a specific example because I don't think it's as I'd like to change the level of what's being asked for by saying in the second bullet, by saying show estimated carbon emissions and carbon drawdown. And I asked Brian, it seems to me in documents that I've seen about our native, the CSU work, I think it was coming from CSU, we have an estimate of the amount of carbon that our native grasslands sequester per acre. And those are estimates. And so they give us an estimated quantity to use to illustrate the value of using the ecology term, ecosystem services that are provided by the grasslands in terms of carbon sequestration. Similarly, there's that kind of an estimate for our ag lands. And I think that's the kind of rough estimate that would be useful for us to put together to show both our audiences and council what a department could do. And I think I totally agree with the suggestion that we want to encourage council to expedite a citywide carbon accounting system, but I don't want to have our efforts blocked until the city gets that together. I think we can, in the meantime, we can put together estimates that are relevant for the 46,000 acres that we can deal with.
Dan, I'm sure.
And the department operations that are used in managing those 46,000 acres.
Dan, I'm sure that there's a lot of points to this that you probably understand a lot better than I, but to say something as simple as, is there a software program that we could get? I don't know the price of these, that we could get and utilize and be able to start looking at this. I feel like that sounds so simple and easy, and it just couldn't be that simple and easy.
My preference is a graphic rather than getting all in bold, embedded in a computer system and making it work over the next 2 or 3 years. I'd like to just see the simple graphic based on the data we already have available.
At your September meeting, we didn't make a huge point of this, but I mentioned at that time that one of the projects we were looking at for 2022 was to do a carbon audit for the department. And we've had continued conversations about that and have now agreed to move forward with that project in 2022. And that could result in any one of these things that you're talking about, Karen, or you're talking about, Caroline. First, we need to understand how GAP or SEC applies to the department's drawdown efforts, because that's our main contribution to the city as a whole.
Mhm.
Doing this in conjunction with climate initiatives and coming up with a result that's meaningful, that means something to everyone for future planning. So that's one thing I'd like to mention, but I also wanted to mention that I did do a breakdown of our 2022 CIP that you recently approved. And just looking at that, we have 4 projects that that support directly these direct initiatives in the master plan to the tune of $335,000. So 6% of our budget. Then we have another 11 projects in the 22 CIP that contribute to one of the 7 indirect climate related strategies to the tune of $1.2 million. And then an additional 23 projects that contribute at some level at the cost of 3.2 million. So we have well over 70% of our CIP budget in 2022 is going to projects that address these direct and indirect climate strategies that we have. So it's not like we're not doing anything. We're doing quite a bit, and I think you're hitting on how do we communicate this better? How do we show this better? And I think we can do that through this carbon audit project in 22.
John, I think what you're hearing is that the board definitely supports what you've just laid out and what was you discussed at the September meeting. I think the concern, and I don't want to speak for the entire board, but I think I'm okay saying that the concern was in the September update, we didn't feel that the city accommodated or recognized the extent to which open space is contributing to some of the the climate issues. And I think that's the concern now, is that we acknowledge the fact that these natural lands are playing an instrumental role in reducing carbon locally and contributing to the national reduction as well.
Yeah, and I can't reiterate enough times how important a simple graphic is as opposed to pages and pages of a report.
Great. And thanks, Dave. Yeah, and I do believe that the climate initiative staff very much see the value of what open space contributes to climate solutions overall for the city. And we've been working quite closely with them on a number of initiatives. And I think that, I've talked to Brett Karen about how can we show these better in an annual report or something, some way that that people can get their heads around it a little bit more. And so look for that, and I'll try to keep working with him on that sort of effort. So
yeah, I think getting the word out is critical.
Yep.
One big goal of mine on this would be the next time we're in front of council talking about reauthorization of any sales tax, which we have years, I believe, until, that at that time, we'll be able to show that number such that we can make a stronger case about how their investments in us are helping them expedite their goals towards neutrality.
I think that's a good idea.
And I'd hate to wait that long, but yes.
Yeah, I think it's all good ideas, and like I said, if someone has anything to add when I say this, I would appreciate it, because there's a lot that I don't know, but I just feel like without inserting something in this portion into just almost every line of our financials, it will just move so slowly that it will be a long time before something gets accomplished. So my hope is that there's something that can be done. And once, I just feel like the hard part is kind of creating something. And then after that, you're able to, move numbers around and see where there's a lot of benefit and a lot of things to work on. And I just think it could have a lot of really cool implications for open space that we might not even completely understand yet.
Well, maybe just to follow on that, Caroline, one of the things that Brian and I have been really talking a lot with Brett and Jonathan about is how do we position ourselves to take advantage of any state or federal funding that becomes available. And so that I think that's another really great reason to do this carbon audit next year, so that we can start to use that as a baseline and use that as a way to justify additional funding that we might be able to get to support good initiatives.
And with that, Karen, I hear you with the graphic, but would the carbon audit be some software program that you would input all the numbers from our department?
Something like that. That's one of the things we would need to explore, what the best approach, what the best approaches are out there to do that, and what scale that we would have the funding to dive down into and figure out. But yeah, that is the type of thing that Brian and I would look at in developing a scope of work for that.
Awesome. We can wrap up a few minutes early if everyone would like to, or does anyone have any final?
I'd like to hear from John if you disagree with me about the first blue or red star.
I kind of didn't address that because Karen, we really we've struggled with the terms direct and indirect, and there's probably a better way to put it. These are all really super important strategies for addressing climate solutions, but there's been a conversation among the staff just about, well, some of these things actually say do something about climate, and some of these things, they don't specifically say that, and we do it for other reasons as well. So whether there was a climate crisis or not, we would be preserving and restoring important habitat blocks and corridors. That's part of our mission. That's part of who we are at Open Space. So that's why we use the term indirect. Brian, you might have better insight into this to add to that, but that was generally the reason why we went with those terms. They're not ideal.
Yeah, right on. Exactly what you said. And in some ways, we like to think that EHR1 is completely complementary to climate goals, but there could even be scenarios where it's in conflict, meaning what makes sense for a wildlife corridor may not make sense for getting the most carbon put into the ground. Clearly, we look for the places where we get co-benefits, but I think there's enough room for interpretation around EHR1 that some of the work there would have climate benefits that are obvious and important, and other choices may be neutral, and some could even not have a climate benefit. So each one of these, you can do that same sort of logical thought exercise and try to convince yourself whether it's direct or indirect. But we tried to take a pretty conservative approach to where we put the red stars as a first pass.
You've totally lost me. Give me a more concrete example so that I can understand where EHR1 would not be a plus for drawdown.
Well, maybe another way to think of it is if you were really trying to manage a piece of land to maximize carbon benefit or carbon drawdown, that may run into conflict with the idea of maintaining large habitat blocks or preserving corridors. Clearly, they're related.
Can you give me an example? Just paint a for instance for me.
Yeah, for instance, if you wanted to convert a piece of land from a grassland to a shrubland to get a net carbon benefit, and you wanted to use certain species that are fast growing or that put a lot of carbon into the ground, that would give you a climate benefit. That may not be the right choice to make given preservation of native biodiversity and preserving large habitat blocks and creating migratory pathways for wildlife.
Yeah,
I'm not saying that's something we would do.
In my mind, that example is not EHR1, it's something else. if you really did EHR1, it would draw down carbon.
Yeah, and I think if you go back to September, one of the slides we presented is how do we adjust our thinking? And this is a controversial area to think about what baselines we're
Right.
managing lands towards. Is it historic conditions, current conditions, or some future state? In the traditional model of restoring back to former conditions, you're right, like that scenario wouldn't be in play. That would not be a type of action that would be consistent with restoring to the past.
Brian, my suggestion is that it just might be easier to make that red. And you would not have to go through a long explanation.
I would say we just have a star that says direct or indirect and star it all.
Well, I'm appreciative that this got brought up because I think that this is a great example of incorrect versus correct versus right versus wrong versus tweaking versus leaving. And this is why this conversation is so difficult, because it's like uncharted and new territory. So it's and no one really likes to be wrong, right? Like, it's uncomfortable or hard or whatever. So I appreciate everyone talking about this and, willing to move towards it, which undoubtedly means that, a lot of us are going to have to go back to the drawing board several times. And so I appreciate everyone that's willing to do that.
I've got one comment too, Brian. From my point of view, whether we're doing something or not won't be relevant to the final accounting that will be important to us politically. And we're willing to take credit for the $500 million of taxpayer money over the years that purchased all these lands, creating this benefit. And if we can tweak the system to make it do even more better, that's great. But our preservation project of the many years has this underlying benefit that we're willing to take credit for.
And in fact, I'm going to suggest that this might be an overarching message. Open space and mountain parks, sequestering carbon for your future.
As long as we don't have any catastrophic wildfires.
Then it just starts over again.
Asterisk.
Well, thank you for everyone with this meeting. And before
I don't want you to close yet, Caroline.
Oh, you do? I just wanted to make sure that Dave got
No.
a extra thank you for all of his work. I didn't know people have to run.
I just want to say, Brian, that if we start plowing up open space land, especially high quality grasslands or HCAs, and start planting other things, I think there's going to be a huge backlash. And I just don't see that in the thinking of our open space and mountain park system. And I'm wondering if you're speaking for some large segment of the staff or if this is just your personal view.
I would say neither.
I thought it was a for instance. I thought you wanted to, for instance.
Yeah, it's a for instance. And it's just to start having conversations about what kind of future are we going to inherit and are we really prepared for it? And if we're getting asked to take climate action, testing sensitivities on where the lines in the sand are and understanding clearly what our charter purposes are and where the community is key input to that. And I think in terms of staff, we haven't really circled the wagons to figure out where we lean on staff one way or the other. But I think we're all very familiar with the precautionary approach, and any sort of quote unquote tinkering that we'd be doing would be small scale, experimental, and involve a lot of stakeholder engagement before we rolled anything out on a bigger scale. And then we're going to be looking at those opportunistic places like the Bennett property, which Brett mentioned, places where we have other issues that we want to solve at the same time as trying to increase our climate benefit as some of the first places we'd be looking, as opposed to intact native systems. John, looks like you wanted to say something there as well.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's really important. These questions that Brian's bringing forward are ones that are being talked about across the country as to how do we do the best natural area management moving forward in this time of climate change. And there are going to be some tough questions that staff and board are going to have to wrestle with over the next 10 to 15 years.
Dave, how's this as a tagline? Yeah, sequestering carbon for 50 years and ready to do an even better job for the next 50.
That works. You'd have to have a cowboy hat for that, though.
Speaking of 50 and Hal's true style, I'm talking about, can we just figure out a disclosure, and Hal somehow puts $50 million investments up on the board. So I love it.
I appreciate Brian's putting on the hat of a provocateur. But I also am really concerned about staff suggesting strategies off the cuff that fly in the face of, as Brian himself said, the charter and the community vision for open space. And I wince when I hear that we're creating, I don't know what they're called, pollinator gardens or wildflower gardens at trailheads, which to me means we're digging up whatever habitat is at the trailhead and planting something new. And that makes me wince hard. And I don't know where that approach is coming from or why it's being done. But if we start tearing up other parts of the system and making plantings in native habitat, I think that is diametrically opposed to work at some place like the Bennett property or any of our ag lands that are intended to sequester carbon in an ag land setting. So I would say to staff, please, if you're going in that direction, make it public and come to the board and get agreement on going in that direction, because I think that's a really different road to go down than where we have been. Or where I think we're headed with the master plan.
I was just going to say, Karen, I agreed with your first part, but when you went to the second part on pollinator gardens, that's a different conversation. But I did not interpret Brian's hypothetical as a definitive staff position. I just interpreted it as, that would be something that you would result in what we were talking about, but not that it was going to happen.
Does that mean you're in favor of pollinator gardens at trailheads?
No. So then, yeah, the pollinator gardens kind of took us in a different direction. I am not in favor of them, but I think that's a different conversation.
Okay.
Wonderful. I guess, yeah.
Caroline, are we done?
I think if no one has any final thoughts, it is time to wrap up. So Dave, thank you so much for all that you did and organized, and Dan, you as well. I think it was a really, really cool topic that you picked. And I think that everyone, like the way that Hal said it, it's like a breath of fresh air to be able to step back and really discuss like big picture things. And it felt good to have that type of discussion.
Well, you were instrumental as well, Caroline. So thank you for that too.
Yeah. And
next time, maybe we can do it in person, as you two have been advocating for the whole time.
That's the Christmas party.
Yeah, and thank you to staff and Dan and everyone involved in helping us. I think this was a really great retreat, and many more wonderful ones to come. I know we said that at the end of the meeting, we would circle back around on a couple of things. My brain is getting a bit foggy. Do we want to do that? Do we want to send out an email and touch on that later? Is anyone's brain functioning better than mine?
What was it that we were going to come back to?
We were going to come back to discussions of additional meetings in some capacity. I don't think to talk about them, to decide if we wanted to have a meeting to talk about meetings or something thereof.
My impression of the one piece of unclosed business was on the rules and procedure, who are going to be the point people on that and how are we proceeding? I felt like most of the tabled business was on that topic.
Yeah, so I think what we decided is that Leah is keeping kind of a list of topics to be further discussed. And so Leah, maybe if you can, clean that up and send it out, then we can kind of decide when and what we want to further consider. Would that be
Yeah,
okay?
and
Are you not? Okay. Okay.
that sounds good to me too. And my only question is procedurally, if we want to approve any of the recommendations we have talked about today as formal motions, can that come from matters from the board as a motion, or does it need to come in a different part of the agenda?
No, it can come under matters, and like I said, we'll do a parallel track here. We'll put together what we feel what was consensus on the changes, and we'll have that document be ready for matters, a formal thumbs up, if you will, at a matters through a motion, as well as we'll summarize the continual discussion topics that you all feel like you would like to continue to discuss for future improvements. So in November, we'll bring forward a clean document to actually for you all to consider and approve.
Great, thank you. That'd be
Right.
very helpful.
So are we just talking about the what is it called? Rules and procedures, or are we also talking about adaptive management recommendations and?
Oh, no, just the rules and procedures is what I was talking about.
Okay, so if we wanted to go into recommendations on adaptive management, how would we deal with that?
So Leah, do you have some notes on those conversations that you could prepare and include in what we will get subsequently?
I can, if that's what you need.
Do you think that you have sufficient notes to do that?
I think so. I mean, Dan, I could maybe run it past.
Yeah, and Karen, I believe you have captured what you thought were the agreed upon points as well. You read them off at the very end. Send those to Leah, and between Leah's notes, my notes, your notes.
How about this? My notes are just scribbled in the margin of this page.
Yeah, so are mine.
Oh, mine.
How about if Leah sends her suggestions, I'll go back and listen to the tape and revise it and then submit it to Dan. Is that an okay sequence?
Sure.
That's fine with me, Dan, yeah.
Great, thank you, Leah.
Yeah, despite all my protestations, I think the tape actually might be somewhat beneficial in this regard.
Right.
I'm noting that at 4:41, Dave.
Yeah, thank you.
You said that.
And I just ask for my part, if any board member is going to lift a motion in upcoming meetings, that we just get something in the actual agenda under matters to make sure we do a good job in disclosure. And a week lead time, that's ideal if that's possible.
Thank you all again.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon, evening.
Too.